as I believe we in Europe have not understood yet our full potential, our full strategic potential in this world, and the responsibilities we have, and the roles we can play in this world, the positive roles. And in Germany, there has been a lack of engagement and lack of, I think, self-confidence to act as an important player on a world stage, and to also to the effect that Germany hasn't really been very outspoken about human rights violations committed through the Chinese government and so forth.
Where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says rolling stones don't gather moss? Hello everyone, I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. If you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. A Tibetan proverb that reminds us that even the smallest voice can disturb silence, and even the furthest struggle can stir action across the world. Today we speak with someone who embodies this very spirit, Kai Müller, Executive Director of the International Campaign for Tibet. He spent decades ensuring that the voices of Tibet are heard beyond the plateau, in the halls of parliaments, in the conscience of global citizens, and across continents. Kai is a German jurist and social scientist in Germany, leading the advocacy of human rights for Tibetans. This conversation is not just about East or West. It's about the power of solidarity that transcends geography. It's about how people, regardless of where they stand on the map, can stand together for justice, dignity, and the freedom of others. Kai, a warm welcome to you and the audience to this episode of Between the East and the West, where shared humanity will take center stage. So, when I dive in, the first thing I would really like to know, because I observe that you've done decades of this, is what first drew you personally and professionally to the Tibetan cause? What stirred you to speak out for a people and a culture not your own?
Thank you, Meenu, for having me. I feel very flattered by your introduction, and I feel actually I stand very much behind, or I'm very much behind of the Tibetans I got to know over these past years and these 20 years actually of my work for Tibet, which have been very inspiring. And if you ask me about how I got to this issue, I mean, I could relate to you my career steps, but actually I would very much like to look at it as a growing connectedness to people and an issue that developed over the years. Of course, as being a professional in international law and in social sciences, I've started looking at this issue from that angle. And it's very much also a legal issue, since we're speaking of human rights or self-determination of Tibetan people. But over the years, it has become a interconnectedness to people, to friends, to maybe role models. And of course, there's the Dalai Lama as the perhaps supreme role model, if you will, of the Tibetans. And this really has had a deep impact on my understanding also of myself as an individual, also, but also on someone who is a German citizen who's been socialized here in Germany, very much in a traditional sense in the countryside here in Western Germany. So it also pushes one, and it pushed, I think I've observed it with a lot of people who have come to work on a Tibetan issue in the West, it pulls oneself into a sort of self-reflection of oneself and also the responsibilities we have as citizens here in Germany towards other peoples, other countries, and altogether to so many situations on a global scale. So I think that's sort of a growing connectedness over the years, and that's something that really stands out of my work, I would say.
You mentioned that as over the years, you evolved and you got to understand yourself better with the cause that you were advocating. Can you expand a little on that, please?
I think it's politically, of course, we are looking at China, at our relationship from Germany, from European countries, or from the West altogether, vis-a-vis China, and how we perceive our responsibility towards those who are subjected to repression and suppression and oppression by the Chinese government, namely the Tibetans, also the Uyghurs, and recently also the Hong Kongers. So it is something that requires, I think, a reflection of how we have come to view China, Tibet, East Turkestan, Hong Kong, other places far away from us. And I'd say on a political and social level, it means that we have to, which also a lot of Tibetans are raising, we have to decolonize our thinking in terms of looking at the Tibetan people, at the Uyghur people, at others in Asia. And we have to really reflect on our own way of looking in the mirror of how we perceive ourselves as a state or a society that is on par with those other empires, or are we in solidarity with those who are actually also expressing their right to self-determination, on autonomy, on insisting on how to live their own lives as their own masters of their lives. And I think there are a lot of parallels between how Germany, for example, is looking at Eastern Europe and how Germany is looking at China, and Russia, China, the big empires of today, and how our policies and how our politics here in the West have been almost identical towards these empires. And I think that on a political level, that needs to be understood much better, and there needs to be a deeper reflection here and a change in politics, and that's how we view those so-called little peoples like the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, or if you look at Europe, how we look at the Ukrainians, how we look at the Balts, how do we look at the Czech and the Polish from Germany. So there are a lot of parallel situations in my view, and it's actually quite striking. So that's, of course, a very deeply political level. The personal level is, of course, to really reflect on our own moral high grounds that we take as democracies, as countries that support or are very publicly stand up for rule of law. We may be looked at quite differently from the outside. And I'd say in my conversations with Tibetans, while Tibetans are very humble in most situations, I would say, and very kind and very thoughtful in how they communicate towards us in the West, I've come to feel and sort of detect a certain disappointment of how we behave or how we conduct our relationship with dictatorships, with autocracies, and not in solidarity with the Tibetans. So looking on from the outside on us as individuals and us as polities or as societies, the picture is much, much different than we would like to see ourselves here in Germany, in particular, sometimes on a moral high ground, which I think is not really justified if we look at the record of relationship with China, for example, from Germany. So that sort of also, I think it provokes us to rethink ourselves and to be more critical of ourselves. And that has been, I think, one of the, let's say, the gifts, so to speak, that I've received from this work on Tibet. It's a view from the outside of ourselves, and I think that's very important for us, because I think the confined or limited view on ourselves is the cause for some problems here in Germany and also with regard to the outside world.
Okay. So when we, when you have been saying we, how the way we look, when you are saying the we is the Western world, or when we are saying we, it must be Europe, I am assuming, or the Western part of Europe, right? Who's we?
Yes, I would say, I mean, if it's quite striking, if you cross the border to Czech Republic or to Poland, for example, the view on China is quite different. I mean, the Eastern Europeans understand what it means to be under occupation, and they look at China very much more critically than we do in Germany, or maybe go to France, go to Spain or Italy. The view on those autocracies is quite different. So distinctly, we've been fortunate here in Germany to after the Second World War to having experienced the support of the free world and to live in a democracy and the rule of law. And I think we take too much for granted, since we haven't experienced autocracy over the past 70 years, at least in the western part of Europe. And so I think that's a big difference already here in Europe in view of the Tibetans also. And there's lots more solidarity for Tibet in the Czech Republic, given the smaller amount of population there. It's quite striking how deeply rooted their solidarity is with the Tibetan people. If you think of the relationship of Václav Havel, the late president, with the Dalai Lama beginning in the 90s, there surely is a difference. And if I speak of I think nowadays also the entirety of Germany. I think the political culture after 1990, after we've enjoyed our reunification here in Germany, has continued. And the view of China, I think there are long lines of politics and also how the public talks about China and the Tibetans. Those long lines persisted after 1990 and continued until today, maybe until the invasion of Russia into Ukraine in 2022, the full invasion, one must say. So I think there may have been a change taking place over the past 2 or 3 years, at least in view of China in the general public. But that may change again, because there's much corporate interest into China, and that is quite resilient.
Okay, so I'll separate this next part into 3 parts based on what you just said, so that I understand better. So the worldview, when we say the worldview, the eastern part of Europe, for example, then you mentioned Italy and the other countries and Germany and some other parts of the world, their view and their perspective of China and the situation and autocracy, so to say, you are saying is widely different, how they view it, right? Am I getting it right?
From each other, or
From each other.
No, I think that those countries, well, let me put it that. No, I wouldn't say. I mean, there are differences, there are nuances. Of course, the United States is much more outspoken on Tibet. Europe is less outspoken on Tibet and on China, as I believe we in Europe have not understood yet our full potential, our full strategic potential in this world, and the responsibilities we have, and the roles we can play in this world, the positive roles. And in Germany, there has been a lack of engagement and lack of, I think, self-confidence to act as an important player on a world stage, and to also to the effect that Germany hasn't really been very outspoken about human rights violations committed to the Chinese government and so forth. And so there are differences. There are differences. There are more differences between those societies who have experienced autocracy themselves recently, and vis-a-vis those countries in the West who have not experienced autocracies over the past decades. So there's really a difference, for example, between the Czech Republic and Germany, or the Baltic states and Germany. So the Balts and the Czechs, for example, they know from own experience what it means to be subjected to oppression, repression, to be occupied countries in a foreign occupation. And so the view on China and on Tibet is much, much different. Even if you look at the Czech Republic having experienced self-immolations in the late 60s, and if we look at Tibet, from 2009 on, more than 150 Tibetans had self-immolated for political reasons. So there are really connections there. And I think that makes a difference. That makes a big difference. And that while there are nuances among the Western states, United States certainly stands out, or has stood out until recently, for being much more outspoken. Europeans can do much more. Germany can do much more towards China and towards Tibet. And I think that's also a matter of priorities set by our government, but also the general public is responsible here.
The question is, when I go to the next one, let me come back to a little part of this so that other people understand it better with the context. Just a little brief and background on why and how the International Campaign for Tibet was set up in the first place, because I think we quickly went to the second base without crossing the first one. So there will be a lot of people out there, I'm sure the younger lot, who might benefit with a little bit of a gist on how and why it was set up in the first place.
Yes, ICT, the International Campaign for Tibet, was set up originally 1988 in the United States, after the Dalai Lama had undertaken a series of international visits also to the United States. And it was in the 80s that the situation of the Tibetans had become more known to the world, also because of the stature and the personality of the Dalai Lama traveling around the world. And support grew in those countries, and particularly in the United States, where a number of supporters thought, okay, we need to set up something that works when the Dalai Lama is not in country, because he is, of course, he is living, and he's lived at the time in his exile home in Dharamsala in India. So he was not all the time around, of course. And the idea was brought up that there should be an organization that does the advocacy, does the campaigning and the information work towards government and parliament and to the media about what is going on in Tibet specifically, and what are the ambitions and the aspirations of the Tibetans and the Dalai Lama. So the International Campaign for Tibet was set up in 1988 in Washington, D.C. It quickly grew. Their support of the Dalai Lama, also in general public, grew in those days, with a lot of public personalities, musicians, artists supporting the Dalai Lama and the issue of Tibet. And ICT then in 1998 moved on to set up an office in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and then in the follow-up set up an office in 2002 in Berlin here in Germany. And in the meantime, we've got an additional office in Brussels and also some field researchers in Dharamsala in India ourselves. So we are an organization that is supported by, I mean, it's safe to say, more than 100,000 people in the world globally. In Germany, it's around 15,000. The bulk of the people, of course, in the United States of America, supporting ICT with with donations, with participating in our events, or even just sharing the message. And that matters already a lot. And we engage also the youth in Washington, D.C. in particular, with the so-called Lobby Day towards the U.S. Congress, where a lot of Tibetan youth participate in meetings set up by our office there with Congress people, with senators, to talk about Tibet and to talk about what is going on and what, of course, the Tibetans expect from the government and the parliament and Congress to undertake, to also to relate to the Chinese government. So we are actually active on a lot of fronts. I myself, I'm particularly busy with coordinating our work towards the United Nations in Geneva, partly also in Paris, towards the UNESCO in Geneva. There's the United Nations Human Rights Council, where we are talking, of course, to diplomats. We are engaging in United Nations fora. We speak at the plenary of the United Nations Human Rights Council. We directly look into the faces and the eyes of the Chinese government representatives and confront them with what we have researched, with what our analysis is, and what human rights-based aspirations are. And by doing so, we attempt to hold the Chinese government accountable. Also, we ask governments to speak out there quite concretely at this venue, which still is important despite all the, I think, shortcomings of the United Nations. So that is quite concrete. We try to engage for issues with regard to issues. The environment, climate change is a big topic, as the Dalai Lama has early on already pointed out, the importance of the environment in Tibet, which is crucial for most of Asia, I would say, in terms of water, in terms of climate, natural resources, and so forth. We speak of individuals that are being persecuted, put into jail for peacefully expressing their views, practicing their religion, revering the Dalai Lama, who are quite gruesomely tortured, who have to endure long prison sentences and not a humane conditions in those Chinese prisons. So we talk about big issues, we talk about individuals. That's what I would like to stress here, because it's not about it's about people. It's about the Tibetans who are who actually have to live a life quite differently from ours, namely in a totalitarian environment. Totalitarianism meaning state entities interfere with the very private lives and thoughts of the individuals, trying to really transform their behavior. And that is really touching the most inner core of what we are, of who we are as human beings. Namely, we want to be free in our thoughts. We want to revere those, or don't revere those, anybody on that, in that sense. So freedom, liberty, also justice and equality, that's really the core of the issues in Tibet. And on all of those issues, and that's, I think, the striking element here when one thinks of Tibet. It's so connected to each other. I mean, if we look at people who are protesting against mining, illegal mining, chipping away a holy mountain in Tibet, for example, and they're being persecuted, they're put to jail. And it's so interconnected in so many senses. It's very striking. And actually, I mean, the very essence of what's going on in Tibet, everything is connected to each other. Yeah, coincidentally, a Buddhist belief here. But that's really the core of our work, issues and people, and the people are center.
What I understand is that there's been a lot of awareness over the years which have been created to air the issues there. However, then the question comes, keeping in mind the geographical spread of that awareness and the length of time of that awareness, what has been then the impact? Question, logical question. Let's say if I didn't know enough about it, my logical question would be, why would not the Chinese government let up? Can't we, if so much pressure, is the pressure not enough on them to let go? I mean, there's one possibility, let go and let that place be a no man's land by the UN Council. For example, it could be, sounds like a very simple solution, of course, sitting on the outside. But in total, with so much apparently so much pressure, keeping in mind now the fact that China is a huge economy. Any product you buy anywhere in the world, we're sitting in Germany, anything you order on Amazon will be from China. So is that because of the economic power, the pressure has to be less? Is that the point? Or there is no way other countries can influence another country? Am I too confusing here, or?
I think I know where you're getting to. I mean, all human rights related work is, so to speak, an investment into hope. Basically, it's an asymmetric conflict where you have one very weak stakeholder and one very powerful. And therefore, the weak stakeholder needs more international support by other states. So now those states need to set their priorities of what's important to them. Unfortunately, as you've said, they are prioritizing their own well-being, their own, well, perhaps short-sighted, if I may say, well-being with regard to relationship to China. And you cited the economic interest, of course, particularly for Western countries, and Germany stands out here. China has been one factor of success, of economic success. A lot of jobs depend on the automotive industry that exports and builds, manufactures so much in China. But this is not a God-given natural state. I mean, it used to be different until China in 2001 joined the WTO. That economic model was far from being successful and maybe about to collapse. So that was really one of the turning points here in time. And that's not so long ago. So things can be changed. And if we give up believing in that we as state, as a society, as an entity, as individuals, we give up that we are in charge of things, that we can change things, then of course all of those aspirations are meaningless and they're futile. I think so. It touches really again the very core of a belief of who we want to be. Do we want to change things in this world, or do we allow to become just mere objects of others who do understand that they can make decisions and change things? So I think at the core, of course, it's priorities set, short-sighted priorities, because now we see the backlash that the economic prosperity we enjoy here in Germany, they come with conditions suddenly being put on us by a autocratic regime that's applying totalitarian measures on a part of their subjects or objects, if you will, and that are having a partnership without limits with a genocidal regime, namely Russia, as conducting war crimes on a daily basis, and that has others threaten our eradication from the map here as a very state and society. So I think that needs to be a wake-up call, and I think it's not a God-given or natural state of affairs that we here have to bow down and kowtow to a regime just for our short-sighted model of prosperity. And it used to be different. It works different. And if we look at our politicians, our stakeholders in politics who actually make those decisions, I'd always say, okay, there's a lot of responsibility there, a lot of responsibility with corporations. But as you say, it's also on us as citizens to be responsible and to also understand that we also can make choices. I mean, we have been beneficiaries as citizens of this economic model. We see the prosperity in some areas of Germany that's really tremendous because of the corporate connections to China. If you look at the automotive industry in southern Germany or northern Germany, in those areas. And the wealth there is directly connected to our relationship to China. And I think that is something. It's very easy to point your fingers at the politicians. That's what I wanted to say. But, we have to also look at ourselves in the mirror as citizens. Okay, we are enjoying this wealth. Where's our responsibility in all of this? And that's my question, because if then some politician says, okay, we need to disconnect from the Chinese economy or even de-risk, and this has got consequences for us in our wealth and our prosperity, maybe just on a minimal stage, is this politician going to be re-elected here if he confronts us with this reality? And that's the problem here that we have to face in our society, that actually the bad news, nobody wants to tell us the bad news, because we want to pretend here, particularly in Germany, with our economic model so far and the political model so far, that we're not responsible for anything that goes on outside. And that's one sentiment here in the West, that we are not responsible for what is going on in Tibet. We are not responsible for what is going on in East Turkestan with the Uyghurs. But then listen to the Tibetan exile prime minister, who's traveling also Germany and is traveling many countries, and he's talking to people. And I recently heard him saying that in a quite pronounced way, it's you talking to a German audience. It's you who have really fed this dragon. Now you have to fight this dragon, or you have to live with it. It's your job to do something about this situation. You can't just continue like this. It's your responsibility. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that, what he says, of course, in a very pronounced fashion. But that's something that's very striking. I think he's right in many ways, and could talk about what that means in detail. But I think it's really all of our responsibility. And I think there's a great deal, and I think it needs to be also recognized. There are a lot of people in Germany who think differently, and a lot of people in those Western countries who come to think differently. For one, because they feel this connection, they feel there is injustice, they want to support the Tibetans, they want to support a different way of conducting politics, like the Dalai Lama promotes this, with this middle way policy, middle way approach, by not asking for the maximum, by already knowing, okay, this got to be a win-win situation for all of us, for the Chinese, for the Tibetans. So instead of quarreling and talking so much, we come to you, okay, look, we do not need to be an independent country. We have been, that's what we're insisting on. But we can be part of your country. But then you have to guarantee that we can live our culture, we can live our religion, and we can be masters of our own life. And I find that's very appealing. I think it's a different way of doing politics, and Dalai Lama has been really a role model for how things could be dealt with differently in this world, instead of having conflicts, violent conflicts, all this bloodshed in the world of today. I think people, they aspire something different, and that's also part of our society, and that's why an organization like ours exists, for example, because we are being funded by many donors here in Germany who support our work, our approach, and actually who would like us to talk to stakeholders in that sense.
So the next question we'll have now, based on what you just said, I'll just state two contradictory statements. Tibet is geographically remote for many in the West. Geographically. And yet it resonates deeply with some people around the world. True? Yes. A part. The B part. And when I say the A part, my point question then is, why do you think that this struggle touches something universal? However, B part, as you pointed out, there are many who are not touched deeply enough by the struggle either to empathize, understand, or stand up for it. So there are two contradictory things, like many contradictory things which exist in the world. My question comes down to the first part. The struggle resonates obviously with that many in the world who you said there has been self-immolations, there people are standing up in US. Now Tibet is there. If you look at if we are talking of geography, Tibet is there and there is that, the West. So why should anybody from one end of the world, and why only the Tibetan struggle would, there are many actually, unfortunately, in the world that we see today, and I am shocked. As the years go on, I'm more and more shocked to see rising conflicts in a world where technological advancement has gone into the sphere of AI and getting beyond. Number of rising conflicts and power gain, etc. We are moving more and more outside than inside. However, in that world, it's still the struggle still resonates with some people across enough to the fact that there is an international campaign for Tibet which is being run, in some ways good, there are potential in some ways to do better, and so on. However, it is still running. The fact there is solidarity of something happening in one part, people are standing up, there's a beauty to it which is phenomenal. I find that very beautiful. Why do you think that it resonates? Is there something universal about it? Why is it that the others are not I'm just trying to get a viewpoint on this. Otherwise, I can give something a normal statement, which I need to understand from you because you are inside.
I would say, of course, the Tibetan cause is appealing to many globally because of the Dalai Lama and his personality, his ethics, which I think are which represents an aspiration that's in all of us. I think we all would like to aspire to have those qualities in ourselves. Of course, we fail many times, but I think he's the focal point, also a point of projection, I think, of those aspirations. For those seek, all of those values of being, of kindness, of our common human connectedness, of ethics, of moral principles. I think in that sense, the Dalai Lama is certainly a focal point for many in the West. And I think the reason why, I think, of course, it's not millions and millions in Germany who support the international campaign for Tibet or Tibetan cause. Certainly, many have heard of it. But I think our society also, is benefiting from a great many social causes that are being supported by many people. So I don't want to look down on people or even downgrade this kind of commitment. There's a lot of social commitment, social activity, social work here by volunteers in Germany happening, and also in other Western countries where you have a civil society that can engage freely with issues at hand, with social causes, justice, with climate change, and so forth. So I think there's a lot, of course, that are worthwhile to follow. I think with regard to Tibet, it's for one, the person of the Dalai Lama, but I think also the value of the values that are at stake and the treasure that exists in the Tibetan culture. I think Tibetan Buddhism, of course, plays a role which has spread beyond Tibet, is now being visible in many countries across the world. So a lot of Tibetan Buddhist followers also in Germany. So that also plays a role. So I think it's an aspiration on a personal level. And then, of course, people would want to show solidarity. And here it's particularly, I think, the peaceful nature of resistance by the Tibetans and their resilience that's really appealing to people. And also, I must say, the patience that Tibetans in exile are attempting to preserve their culture, their language, religion in exile. If you look at India, at the exile community, but also outside India, for example, Switzerland, United States, other countries where Tibetans are really doing a lot of great work to preserve their culture outside of Tibet. And I think that's really appealing, that there is this kind of commitment under so difficult circumstances by Tibetans. And that's really impressive. Also, to me, it impresses me every time I see how much commitment and energy Tibetans in exile are working under very, very difficult circumstances with very little resources to offer the best for their children and to provide education, to have a religious community and so forth. And that's really impressive. I think over time this has impressed upon people, and the resilience. And I mean, for one could look at, okay, this 7-decade-long struggle by the Tibetans as being, okay, you haven't been successful, but I would like to look at it in a different way. Of course, the political success, Tibet is not free, obviously, is not tangible, but yet the Tibetans are still there. They are still on a political map. They are still relevant in our relationship to one of the most important countries in this world, namely China. And the voices of the supporters matter, and the voices of those organizations matter. And I think the fact that the Chinese government still needs to instill this really pervasive climate of fear in Tibet shows that they are not sure of the allegiance and loyalty of the Tibetans. After 7 decades of this oppressive, overwhelming force, it is quite amazing to me. And all of this done in a peaceful way over the past decades or so with the Nobel Peace Laureate at the top. I think it's quite amazing. And it's really, if one looks at it in a way, a contradiction. Tibet's not free, but Tibet's still on the map.
I'm so glad you said that, because the next few things I had to ask you were precisely that. Because the Tibetan movement has long been associated with non-violence, compassion, and resilience, spiritual resilience. What lessons would that offer to the broader peace and conflict discourse in the rest of the world today?
Yeah, I think it's not just that easy, obviously. What a surprise. But I think it starts actually very early. I think it starts in education of a child. And I find it very interesting that the Tibetan Buddhists and that the Dalai Lama has introduced, together with a very prominent US university, a program called Sea Learning. That's an ethical based educational program for children, and to teach mindfulness, to teach human values and ethics already from an early age on. And I think this program is quite fascinating because it's all already being implemented, not just in the United States, where it actually has been then worked out as such, but we hear also of places like the Ukraine. This is as we know, a conflict-ridden Ukraine, and attacked by Russia, and a constant attack, on daily attack. And there, this program is also taking root, and that's quite positive in a way. I think the Dalai Lama has expressed several times, this should be the century of dialogue and of compassion. I think we are very far away from it. But I think it's not bold to say. Maybe perhaps things look different in a couple of years. Maybe there are some learnings from these violent conflicts, that people break out of this cycle of violence and counter-violence and autocracy, that human values of such as compassion, empathy, are being valued again. And it's got to start early age. I think if I look at myself, my age group, probably too late already. But I have hopes in the younger generation. What gave me a lot of hope was, for one, the engagement of many youth against climate change and for policies that really tackle climate change meaningfully. But also, if I look at the Tibetan issue, there are many young Tibetans nowadays coming out to continue with political work, with campaigning, with advocacy on Tibet. And I find that very inspiring how they do that in a very skilled manner. So I think not everything's lost, but I think we need to be patient. And I think one quite interesting conversation I could witness just recently was with the Tibetan State Oracle, who was asked by a member of parliament, and I was accompanying him, about what did he advise the Tibetan parliamentarians in the face of all those budget cuts from the Trump administration, which had an impact on the Tibetans in exile. And simply the oracle just said, okay, I told them, work and be patient. And I think, and that was quite striking to me, because I mean, it was really the essence. And eventually, I think, as far as I could hear, the Tibetans in exile have managed to secure quite a great deal of that funding once again, which is so important to run social institutions like hospitals and schools in exile. So I think it's quite a simple logic there: patience and work. And I think that's what we need to do. And yeah, so to resolve this dilemma.
You mentioned a while ago about the mindfulness program, which is now also being used in Ukraine. Can you say a little more about that so that I understand that better?
Yeah, this program has been developed by the Emory University in the United States, and together with the Tibetans in exile and the Office of the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. And it's a full scale educational program, and it can be applied in any educational environment, also here in Germany, for example. But I find it interesting that it has been resonating with Ukrainian institutions. I'm not sure how many institutions right now are implementing it, but there is a considerable interest, and also, as far as we know, institutions who are applying it. It's of course a totally different approach to learning, yeah, and emotional learning, a compassionate learning that really requires, I would say, a total rethinking of how we approach school and how we approach the upbringing of our children. And I think the Dalai Lama has always expressed that it's our emotions that we need to be more aware of, that we as individuals need to be not just logical individuals who are trained to act on a rational basis with a cause and a consequence, so forth, but we need to also understand our emotions, and we need to handle them better and to channel them in a productive direction. And I think that's something which I think is very much true from also my very personal experience with school here in the West, and also with our children, that it's really overlooked what potential we have in terms of this emotional education. I think that's something very wonderful. I've seen it being implemented in the Tibetan children's villages in India, which are the home of several thousand Tibetan children, run by the Tibetan Children's Village, which is an NGO, but supported also by the exile government and also by funders from all around the world. So this is being implemented by Tibetans now, and yeah, I hope there are good results. I hope that this takes root in many other countries. Of course, we are, as a political organization, not in a position to promote it directly, but I think we are supporting it very much so.
Do you foresee that also happening in Germany?
There are, I think, plans to do so, which are very much with the Tibetan Buddhist cultural institutions here in Germany. There's one very, very prominent Tibetan Buddhist organization, the Tibet House Germany, based in Frankfurt, who are promoting Tibetan culture, Tibetan ethics and value and religion, language also across Germany. And they're doing it in a very, I think, very brilliant way. And they are the ones who are pushing for this, of course. I mean, knowing the German state of affairs and bureaucracy, it's a very difficult task perhaps to implement it and to create progress here. But I think it matters to inspire and also to introduce those different views and different worldviews on and approaches on our educational system, on our society, on our culture, because I think we can only benefit from it. And I think that's been overlooked here to a great sense, not just in Germany. Emotional learning and ethical learning, compassion for children. I hope it takes root here in Germany.
It is required in Germany, in every part of the world. I think it is an extension of the conversation we had before we started. It's very much required. I think, as you also mentioned, cause and effect. The effect we are already seeing everywhere in the rising conflicts across the world. And the cause lies in the undeveloped minds and hearts of the people. If they had been molded in the right way, with the right understanding and deeper understanding of emotions and the entire internal geography of their connect with the universe and the amazing power that they would themselves have, that would change. I think that would change the entire way the entire geography of the world is handled. The political, it goes beyond geopolitics. So I'm totally with this, very interested. I'll come back to you on this. What I would like to understand is you engage with policymakers and governments across Europe and beyond. How do you keep the human face of Tibet present in rooms full of policy language and strategic interests? It's a difficult task.
Yeah, indeed. It's quite difficult because certainly the level of abstraction is quite high. And on the other hand, there's a lot of competition with other conflicts in the world, other very serious human rights situations in the world, which cannot be diminished. I think we do not want to diminish them in any way. So I think what matters is, for one, actually the legal. I mean, we cannot do without, because we're working in a legal environment, which is the human rights architecture. But on the other hand, the human factor is utterly important. That means we need to make clear what it means for individuals on the ground, what it means if a law is being passed that is curtailing freedom of speech, or that prohibits the portraits of the Dalai Lama to be shown in houses, in private homes, and whatever. So we need to, I think, connect to what human rights violations mean to people, actually. And this is something, that is quite challenging, because most of the times we do not have access to those, as Tibet is as being closed off from the outside world by the Chinese government. But I think it's quite important to have Tibetans in the room themselves to tell their stories, to have Tibetans who relate to what is going on in Tibet towards those policymakers. And I think that makes a difference. And I've seen that making a difference. And of course, a certain persistence helps. We need to be persistent and to come again and again and to be convincing. And also, I think, lastly, we need to, I think, make clear to policymakers what it means for them to not become active, to not do anything about this, what larger implications and meaning it has for them. I think we're very fortunate to have really selfless and compassionate policymakers here in Germany. They exist. But others really act according to a self-interest and also to, I think, a direct relation of any action to themselves and to our polity here. And this is actually where I think it's the connection, because the way we've seen the Chinese government act in Tibet already 10, 20, 30 years ago has been foreboding or has been how to speak, an omen for how it conducts politics to the outside world. And there's a direct correlation between those policies inside towards the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, and now what we've come to see over the past 10 years in their aggressive foreign policy. And that's something that needs to be clear. And to engage on an abstract level, that means we state, or we describe security in terms of our security in Germany and in the West is connected to the security of the Tibetans. That's a long way to go, of course, intellectually, but I think there is a great deal of truth in it, that we understand. And we can also look at Russia over the past 10, 15 years, where it's almost the same development. When we look away from those developments in Tibet or in, let's say, the Ukraine or in Georgia, in East Turkestan, it will come back to us. It will come back to us in a sense that those stakeholders, those entities such as the Russian government or the Chinese government will apply the same politics towards us. And they will test us how far they can go. And with regard to Tibet, they have learned, unfortunately, over the past 15 years or so, they can go quite far. And there have been some governments who've stood up, and I think also a number of politicians here and policymakers who understand this, what's going on, also compassionate policymakers. But there we have it again. The economic interest has really trumped our own security interests. And now it's being understood because China is placing conditions on us, on our access to rare earths, for example, on our market access to China and so forth. So it has come back to us, and now it's being felt also by the corporations. But unfortunately, resilience is still strong. Now, having said this, it's a mix. How we try to underscore the relevance of what we are talking about vis-a-vis politicians about a, as you said, faraway place that has yet a lot to do with who we are and what we do and what we have to expect from the outside world.
So, what happens in one part of the world, if I had to put it very simply, has reverberations in the other part of the world, irrespective of where the location can be.
Definitely. It definitely has. And it's a really great miscalculation to believe that we can isolate ourselves here from all of those developments. They will come back to us. And that's why every little intervention, as it may seem little from here, but for those affected, it means a great deal. It's not just a little intervention on behalf of somebody who's being jailed for revering the Dalai Lama with some images and so forth in Tibet is already meaningful, and that makes a difference.
Now, in whatever you've been observing, is the global conscience growing louder or more indifferent in your viewpoint? What do you think needs to change in the way the world listens?
I think looking at our issue, the Tibet conflict, I believe over the past years, there has been renewed interest and understanding of the situation in Tibet, because people have become more realistic about China altogether after COVID years, after their teaming up, if you will, with Russia, or they're siding with Russia in the Ukraine war. So that there has been a change over the past years, and that makes me confident that the issue will become, I think, or will enjoy more attention in the future. As I said, the world needs to understand that everything is connected, that priorities cannot be short-sighted. Most of the times, those short-sighted priorities are set by our corporations. As some say, German China policy has been determined by our large corporations, not by the chancellery in the past. That's a very provocative statement, but I think there's some truth in it. And I think short-sightedness, I think isolationism, ignorance, I think is very detrimental to ourselves. And I think countries need to understand this better. I mean, those who are themselves aspiring to be living democracies, or states that support the rule of law. So those need to really understand and differentiate what are short-sighted interests, what are long-term interests, what is our connection to the issue, and how does it matter to us? What does it do to us if we do not act?
If you could leave the world with one Tibetan principle, you've been there for a while, and I see that from our conversation, there is evolution. As you yourself mentioned, it allowed you for a deeper understanding of who you are as a person, and a deeper connect with across geographical locations to people as human beings, and to understand them. I think from what I hear, it's the level of compassion and empathy, which I think a lot of people also do not get the chance to get to that level because they've not experienced it, perhaps. And they see a you, me, and they. There's always a point of they, we, and they. And that's where the disconnect happens. Now, if you could leave the world with one Tibetan principle or truth, which something we all need to carry with our own lives, what would that be?
Oh, that's very difficult, because there are many things that are really very precious among the Tibetan culture. And I think it's always the most simple things that matter and that resonate. And I think what I learned is to be kind to everyone, and to live kindness, and to be a kind human being. And I think that's very much the core of everything, to regard your fellow human being as someone who comes from the same, who is also of flesh and blood, has a mother and a father, and that really unites us. And I think that's something the Dalai Lama very much underscores. At least I've heard him expressing it many times. We are all from the same. We are all human beings, and we're all equal. I think that's something, when we look at all the hate, and as you say, the we and the they and the you and the division, it's basically we all want to be happy. And that is something that is very simple. It's a very simple truth, but it's very striking, and we need to really get back to those simple truths. Be kind and live a happy life.
Thank you, because that is itself would be unity in diversity, seeing yourself in another person and seeing the same spirit. And Kai, we've had the opportunity to have some monks on our platform, and we've had some very interesting scientific discussions leading exactly to the same thing. And suddenly one day I was laughing because I realized some of the most well-known scientists in the world were actually some of the deepest philosophers who knew the unity of everything, actually, because they could see beyond what was visible. They could see right at the bottom, at the base of it. So you've pretty much said, I think what you said came out of true experience. I'm assuming if I had asked you the same question 20 years ago, I may not have got the same answer. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, you're right. Yeah. Because it's a lot of personal experience with Tibetans in exile. I mean, of course, in exile, but those who've just come out of Tibet. But I've really seen a distinct warm-heartedness among Tibetans, which really, is quite different than when one comes back from India and coming back to Germany and a very big city like Berlin, for example. People are very different, and it becomes more obvious. I think there is some distinct kindness among Tibetans, and that's something that's impressive.
Thank you, Kai, for being with us today. Our conversation will go on. And for today, I will thank you. And I look forward to having you once again because there were so many places where I wanted to dig deeper. So what I will do is I'll figure out those 2-3 spots and we'll have separate chats on them. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Meenu.
Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.